This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a version of my life that looks completely intact. If you saw me from the outside, nothing would concern you. Nothing would signal that something is missing. I wake up at a reasonable hour. I go to work. I respond to messages. I pay my bills on time. I remember birthdays. I show up when I say I will. I am reliable. I am composed. I am fine. That's the word people would use. She's fine. And the truth is, they wouldn't be wrong. I am not falling apart. I am not in crisis. I am not searching for something dramatic to fix or escape. There is no visible chaos in my life. No obvious pain. No story that demands sympathy. But there is something else. Something much quieter. Something that doesn't show up in conversations or on the surface of a well-managed life. There is a silence inside me that wasn't always there. And it doesn't scream. It doesn't break anything. It doesn't even ask for attention in a way that feels urgent. It just stays. Like a low hum I can't turn off. At first, I didn't question it. I thought this was what stability was supposed to feel like. Calm. Predictable. Under control. I thought this was what I had been working toward all those years when everything felt uncertain. This is what you wanted, I told myself. This is what you worked for. So why does it feel like something is missing? I remember the exact moment that question appeared. It wasn't during a breakdown. It wasn't after something went wrong. It came on an ordinary night, the kind that blends into every other night. I was sitting alone, scrolling through nothing I actually cared about, my body still but my mind restless in that quiet, familiar way. And then it came. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a thought that slipped in without permission. Is this it? I didn't panic. I didn't spiral. I just paused. Because something about that question felt too honest to ignore. Is this what my life is going to feel like now? Not bad. Not painful. Just flat. And what unsettled me wasn't the question itself. It was how quickly I tried to dismiss it. I picked up my phone again. I distracted myself. I told myself I was overthinking. That this is what adulthood looks like. That not everything needs to feel exciting. And maybe that's true. But something in me knew this wasn't about excitement. It was about aliveness. There's a difference between being stable and being alive. And I had slowly, almost carefully, built a life that prioritized one over the other. I didn't notice when it happened. There wasn't a single moment where I chose control over feeling. It was gradual. Subtle. Layered over years of becoming someone who could handle things. Someone who didn't fall apart. Someone who didn't need too much. I became efficient. I became dependable. I became someone others could count on. And somewhere inside that version of me, something softer, something more instinctive, something that used to respond to life instead of managing it, went quiet. Not gone. Just unreachable. Money was part of that shift too. I have money. I earn it. I manage it. I think about it in practical terms. Numbers. Plans. Stability. But if I'm honest, money doesn't feel connected to me. It doesn't feel like an extension of my life. It feels like something I maintain. Something I move around. Something that comes in and goes out without changing anything inside me. I used to think money would feel different. I thought it would bring a sense of expansion. Freedom. Movement. Possibility. But instead, it feels neutral. Flat. Like everything else. And I started to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. It's not that my life is empty. It's that I feel disconnected from it. Disconnected from the part of me that used to feel things more deeply. that used to want things without immediately questioning whether they were practical or necessary or appropriate. There was a time when I didn't filter everything. When I didn't measure every decision against logic. When I didn't pause every instinct long enough to make sure it made sense. I didn't call it anything back then. I just lived it. And now, I can feel the absence of it. Not as pain, but as distance. A quiet distance between who I am now, and something I can barely remember but still recognize when it flickers. Because sometimes, it does flicker. In small, unexpected moments. A piece of music that moves through me a little too deeply. A glance, a feeling, a brief moment where I feel pulled toward something without understanding why. And for a second, I feel it. That sense of being here. Fully. And then it disappears again. And I go back to normal. Back to the version of me that functions. That performs. That maintains. And the strangest part is, no one sees anything missing. Because nothing is visibly broken. There's no crisis to point to. No obvious reason to question anything. But I've started to understand something quietly, slowly, in the background of my own life. Just because something works, doesn't mean it's alive. And just because I can manage everything, doesn't mean I'm connected to it. There is a difference between holding your life together and actually being inside it. And I think, without realizing it, I stepped out of mine. Not completely, just enough to stop feeling it fully. And maybe that's why this question won't leave me alone now. Is this it? Or is there something I lost along the way that I haven't allowed myself to look for yet? If any part of this feels familiar to you, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quietly true, then you're already closer to something most people never stop long enough to notice. And if you want to explore that space with me, slowly, honestly, without pretending or forcing anything, subscribe to this channel. Not for answers, but for something that feels a little more real. Because what I'm beginning to realize is this. Nothing is actually missing. But something inside me has been waiting to be felt again. The energy I couldn't name. I didn't have a name for it. If someone had asked me back then what exactly was missing, I wouldn't have been able to answer. I didn't think in terms of energy, and I definitely didn't think in terms of anything as loaded as sexual energy. That language would have felt exaggerated, maybe even irrelevant to someone like me. What I noticed instead was something much quieter. There were moments, rare, almost accidental, when I felt different in my own body. Not happier. Not more confident. Not suddenly transformed into someone else. Just more here. It would happen without warning. Sometimes when I was walking alone in the city, not thinking about anything in particular. Sometimes when I was listening to a song that seemed to reach somewhere deeper than usual. Sometimes when I was looking at something, a person, a place, even an idea, and I felt a kind of pull I couldn't explain. It wasn't logical. It wasn't planned. It didn't ask for permission. It just moved through me. And in those moments, something inside me softened and sharpened at the same time. My awareness widened. My body felt less like something I was carrying and more like something I was inside of. Time didn't slow down exactly, but it became more textured, more detailed. I was no longer just passing through my life. I was inside it. I didn't think of it as anything important back then. I didn't try to understand it. I didn't try to hold on to it. I just experienced it, and then it would disappear. And I would go back to normal. But now, looking back, I realize those moments had a very specific quality. They weren't about what was happening around me. They were about what was happening within me. There was a kind of inner responsiveness. A sensitivity. A subtle intensity that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. It wasn't something I created. It was something I allowed. And somewhere along the way, I stopped allowing it. Not consciously, but consistently. I started choosing clarity over curiosity, control over sensation, predictability over presence. I became more structured in the way I lived, more intentional in the way I made decisions, more careful in the way I expressed myself. And none of that was wrong. In many ways, it made my life easier. But it also made it narrower. Because that unnamed energy, the one that used to move through me without effort, doesn't respond well to control. It doesn't appear when everything is filtered and managed. It doesn't stay when everything has to make sense. It exists in a different part of experience. A part one had quietly stepped away from. I remember a specific afternoon in New York City, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. I was standing in line at a small coffee shop, half distracted, thinking about work, about what I needed to get done later. My mind was somewhere else, as it usually was. And then I noticed her. She was just standing there, a few feet ahead of me. Nothing about her was designed to attract attention. She wasn't dressed in a way that stood out. She wasn't performing confidence. She wasn't trying to be seen. But she was undeniable. Not because she was doing anything, but because she wasn't holding herself back. There was a kind of quiet presence in the way she stood, the way she moved, the way she existed in that space. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't managing how she appeared. She was simply there, fully. And I felt it. Not as admiration. Not as comparison, but as recognition. Something in me responded to something in her. And it wasn't about her life, her success, or anything external. It was about that quality I couldn't name. That sense of being connected to herself in a way I no longer was. I didn't know what to call it then. But I knew I had felt it before. And I knew I wasn't feeling it now. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the background. Like something quietly waiting to be understood. I started paying attention to those moments when I felt even a trace of that same energy. And I noticed a pattern. It showed up when I wasn't forcing anything. When I wasn't trying to be productive. When I wasn't filtering every thought or reaction. It appeared in moments of openness, of attention without pressure, of being present without needing a result. And just as importantly, I noticed when it didn't show up. It didn't exist in my routines. It didn't exist in my overthinking. It didn't exist in the parts of my life where everything was controlled, planned, and optimized. It was absent from the version of me that was always on. And slowly, I began to understand something that felt both obvious and uncomfortable. I hadn't lost that energy. I had trained myself to ignore it. To override it. To deprioritize it in favor of things that felt more important, more responsible, more acceptable. Because that energy doesn't always align with logic. It doesn't always lead to predictable outcomes. It doesn't always fit into the version of life I had built. And so I learned to quiet it. To move past it. To choose what made sense instead. But what I didn't realize is that this energy, the one I couldn't name, isn't just a feeling. It's a kind of internal guidance system. Not in a dramatic, spiritual sense, but in a deeply human one. It's what creates movement. It's what draws me toward something instead of pushing me through it. It's what makes an experience feel alive instead of just completed. And without it, everything becomes functional, efficient, manageable, but also empty in a way that's hard to explain. That was the part one couldn't articulate for a long time. Why everything in my life could be working and still feel disconnected. Why I could be doing all the right things and still feel like something essential wasn't being touched. It wasn't about needing more. It was about being cut off from the part of me that makes anything feel like it matters. And once I saw that, even faintly, I couldn't unsee it. Because suddenly, the absence made sense. It wasn't random. It wasn't something wrong with my life. It was something missing from my experience of it. Something subtle, but foundational. And for the first time, I began to wonder not how to fix it, but how to stop ignoring it. Where my energy was leaking. It would have been easier if I had been exhausted for a clear reason. If I had been overworked in an obvious way, if something in my life demanded too much of me, if there was a visible source I could point to and say, that's why I feel like this. But there wasn't. That's what made it harder to understand. Because on the surface, I wasn't doing anything extreme. I wasn't working 16-hour days. I wasn't surrounded by chaos. I wasn't constantly overwhelmed. And yet, there was a kind of quiet depletion that followed me. Not the kind that forces you to stop. The kind that slowly thins you out from the inside. At first, I thought I needed more energy, more rest, more balance, more structure. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't need more energy. I needed to understand where it was going. Because it wasn't disappearing. It was being spent. Constantly. In ways that were so small, so habitual, I had never thought to question them. I started noticing it in the mornings. Before I even got out of bed, my attention was already gone. Not physically, but internally. I would reach for my phone almost automatically. Not because I needed to check anything urgent, but because I didn't want to sit in the stillness of waking up. There was something about that quiet space, those first few minutes of the day, that felt uncomfortable. Empty in a way I didn't know how to stay with. So I filled it. Information. Messages. Noise. And without realizing it, I had already given away a part of my attention before the day had even begun. It didn't feel significant. But it was. Because attention isn't just a habit. It's direction. And direction determines what grows. I saw the same pattern throughout the day. My mind was rarely where I actually was. If I was working, I was thinking about something else. If I was talking to someone, part of me was editing what I was saying in real time, adjusting tone, choosing words carefully, monitoring reactions. If I was alone, I was replaying conversations that had already happened, or anticipating ones that hadn't. There was a constant internal movement. Not grounded. Not intentional. Just scattered. And that scattering had a cost. Because every time my attention moved without me choosing it, something in me became a little less present. A little less connected. A little more distant. I started to see that my energy wasn't just being used. It was leaking. In conversations where I wasn't fully honest. In moments where I adjusted myself to keep things smooth. In situations where I said yes without checking whether I actually meant it. None of it felt dramatic. But it was consistent. And consistency is what shapes everything. There was also the way I carried other people. Not in obvious ways. I wasn't the kind of person who took on everyone's problems. But I was the kind of person who felt responsible for how things felt. If something was tense, I noticed. If someone was uncomfortable, I adjusted. If something felt off, I tried to smooth it out. Again, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like being considerate. But over time, I began to realize something subtle. I was spending energy maintaining emotional balance, even when it wasn't mine to maintain. And that energy didn't return. It just dissipated. There was another pattern that was harder to see. The way I reacted. Not externally. Internally. A thought would appear, and I would follow it without question. A feeling would rise, and I would either suppress it or get pulled into it completely. There was very little space between stimulus and response. No pause. No choice. Just movement. And that kind of automatic reaction uses energy in a way that's almost invisible. Because it feels normal. But it's constant. And constant things are the ones that drain the most. Then there was the part one avoided looking at for a long time. The way I numbed. Not in extreme ways. In acceptable ones. Scrolling. Watching. Filling time with things that required nothing from me. It didn't feel harmful. It felt like rest. But it wasn't restoring anything. It was just replacing sensation. And slowly, I began to understand that not all rest is actually restorative. Some of it is just quiet avoidance. And avoidance has a cost too. Because every time I chose distraction over presence, I moved a little further away from myself. It wasn't one big decision. It was thousands of small ones. So small I had never thought to question them. But when I looked at them together, a pattern became clear. There were 3 ways my energy was leaving me. The first was constant output. Always doing something. Always producing. Always responding. Even when it wasn't necessary. The second was emotional leakage. Letting my attention be pulled in directions I didn't choose. Reacting instead of deciding. Adjusting instead of staying grounded. The third was numbing. Replacing feeling with distraction. Replacing presence with noise. None of these felt extreme. That's why they were so easy to ignore. But together, they created something very real. A kind of internal emptiness that didn't come from lack, but from fragmentation. Because my energy wasn't concentrated anywhere. It was spread thin across everything. And when energy is scattered like that, nothing deepens. Nothing builds. Nothing transforms. Everything stays, surface level. That was the part one hadn't understood before. Why things in my life didn't feel like they were growing. Why money felt flat. Why experiences didn't stay with me. It wasn't because nothing was happening. It was because I wasn't fully there for any of it. And once I saw that, I couldn't go back to not seeing it. Because it changed the question. It was no longer about how to get more energy. It was about whether I was willing to stop losing it. And that question was harder. Because it didn't require a new strategy. It required awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable. Because it shows you things you've been doing for so long, they feel like part of who you are. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're just patterns. And patterns can change. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But slowly. If I'm willing to notice where I've been leaving myself. Without realizing it. The body I left behind. There is a version of me that exists entirely from the neck up. She is sharp. Efficient. Capable. She knows how to think through problems before they happen. She knows how to stay composed in conversations. She knows how to choose the right words, the right timing, the right response. She is the version of me that built a life that works. And for a long time, I believed she was all I needed. Because she kept everything stable. She kept everything under control. But what I didn't notice, what I couldn't see while I was busy becoming her, was what she required in return. She required distance. Distance from sensation. Distance from instinct. Distance from the body. I didn't wake up one day and decide to disconnect from myself. It happened quietly. In small, reasonable choices. I chose logic over feeling because it made better decisions. I chose composure over expression because it made interactions smoother. I chose control over spontaneity because it reduced risk. And each of those choices worked. They improved my life in visible ways. But they also moved me further into my mind, and further away from everything else. At some point, I stopped noticing my body altogether. Not in a dramatic way, just in a subtle absence. I would move through my day without feeling grounded. Without sensing anything below the surface. Without that internal awareness of being inside myself. My body became something I carried, not something I lived in. And the strangest part is, I didn't question it. Because nothing was wrong. There was no pain demanding attention. No breakdown forcing me to stop. Just a quiet, steady disconnection that felt normal. Until it didn't. There was a moment when I almost forgot that comes back to me now with a different kind of clarity. I was in New York City, walking alone, the way I often do. The streets were busy in that familiar way. People moving with purpose, noise layered over noise, everything in motion. And I remember feeling something unexpected. A pull. Not toward anything specific. Just something. It showed up in my body first. A warmth, low and subtle. A sense of being drawn toward something I couldn't name. And almost immediately, my mind stepped in. It doesn't make sense. Ignore it. Keep walking. So I did. I kept walking. And within seconds, it was gone. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. And I didn't think about it again. At least not consciously. But now, I see that moment differently. Because it wasn't just a passing sensation. It was a signal. Something in me responding. Something alive, trying to move, trying to express itself in a way that didn't require explanation. And I shut it down automatically. Not because I was afraid. Not because I didn't want it. But because I had trained myself to trust what I could explain, more than what I could feel. That pattern repeated itself in ways I barely noticed. A desire would appear, and I would question it. A reaction would rise, and I would soften it before it could fully form. A sense of curiosity, attraction, even excitement would surface, and I would filter it, adjust it, reshape it into something more acceptable. Over time, I became very good at this. So good that I stopped recognizing what I was doing. I thought I was being thoughtful, measured, self-aware. But what I was actually doing was interrupting myself. Constantly. And the body doesn't respond well to interruption. It doesn't disappear. But it becomes quieter, less expressive, less immediate. Until eventually, it feels like it's no longer there at all. I started to notice it in subtle ways. I didn't feel anticipation the way I used to. I didn't feel drawn toward things with that same quiet intensity. I didn't feel fully present, even in moments that should have felt meaningful. Everything was slightly distant, slightly muted, as if I was experiencing my life through a layer of glass. Close enough to see it, but not close enough to feel it fully. And the more I relied on my mind to guide everything, the further that distance grew. Because the mind is designed to manage, to organize, to predict. But it's not designed to feel. And when it becomes the only place I live from, something essential gets left behind. The body isn't just physical. It's where experience happens. It's where desire is first felt. Where intuition appears. Where something moves before it becomes a thought. And without access to that, everything becomes second-hand. Processed. Interpreted. Instead of lived. I didn't lose my connection to my body in one moment. I left it gradually. Every time I ignored a feeling because it didn't make sense. Every time I adjusted my response to make things easier. Every time I chose control over presence. It was a slow departure. And because it was slow, I didn't notice how far I had gone. Until I started to feel the absence. Not as pain, but as a kind of quiet incompleteness. Like something essential was missing, but I couldn't point to what it was. And the more I tried to solve that feeling with thought, with strategy, with planning, with doing more, the more distant I felt. Because the solution wasn't in my mind. It was in the place I had been avoiding. Or maybe not avoiding. Forgetting. There's a difference between being disconnected and being unaware of the disconnection. And I think for a long time, I was both. I didn't know what I was missing. So I didn't know to look for it. But now, I can feel it. Not fully. Not consistently. But enough to recognize the gap. Enough to understand that the version of me that knows how to manage everything is not the same version of me that knows how to feel anything. And maybe I don't need to choose between them. But I do need to acknowledge something honestly. I built a life using only part of myself. And I left the rest behind. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't fit into the way I learned to survive. And now, the question isn't how to become someone new. It's whether I'm willing to return to the part of me I stopped listening to. Even if it doesn't make sense at first. Even if it feels unfamiliar. Even if it asks me to slow down in a way I'm not used to. Because something tells me that what I've been looking for is not somewhere ahead of me. It's somewhere I quietly walked away from. And it's still there. Waiting. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just patiently. For me to come back. The silent blocks. There are things I didn't notice because they never raised their voice. They didn't interrupt my life. They didn't create visible problems. They didn't force me to stop or question anything in an obvious way. They simply shaped me quietly. And because they were quiet, I trusted them. I thought they were just part of who I was. It took me a long time to understand that some of the strongest forces in my life weren't the loud ones. They were the ones that felt reasonable. The ones that sounded like common sense. The ones that never needed to explain themselves. One of them was shame. Not the kind that people talk about openly. Not the kind tied to a specific event. This was something more subtle. It didn't say, "You're wrong." It said, "That's a bit too much." It didn't say, "Don't do that." It said, "Maybe tone it down." It lived in small adjustments. The way I softened my voice when I felt too expressive. The way I held back when I wanted something that felt excessive. The way I edited my reactions before they could fully exist. It didn't feel like suppression. It felt like refinement. Like becoming a better version of myself. More controlled. More appropriate. More acceptable. And over time, I stopped questioning it. Because it didn't hurt. It just reduced me. Gently. Consistently. There were things I stopped allowing myself to feel, not because I couldn't, but because they felt unnecessary. Too intense. Too complicated. I learned how to stay in the middle of everything. Not too emotional. Not too detached. Just balanced. And that balance looked healthy from the outside. But inside, it created a kind of quiet absence. Because the same part of me that feels deeply is also the part that creates, desires, responds, moves. And when that part is constantly adjusted, filtered, reshaped, it doesn't disappear, but it stops leading. Another layer was harder to see. Because it didn't feel like a limitation. It felt like protection. There were moments, scattered across years, that taught me something without ever stating it directly. Moments where I opened too quickly. Where I expressed something honestly and it wasn't received the way I expected. Where I wanted something, and the response I got made me reconsider wanting it at all. Nothing dramatic. No single event I could point to and say, "That's where it happened." Just small experiences that left an impression. And impressions don't need to be loud to be lasting. They accumulate. They shape behavior. They create patterns that feel like instinct. So I adapted. I became more measured, more aware, more careful. I learned how to stay slightly removed, even when I was present. How to express, but not too much. How to engage, but not too deeply. It wasn't fear. At least, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like intelligence. Like emotional maturity. Like knowing how to navigate the world without exposing too much of myself. But what I didn't realize is that this kind of control creates distance. Not just from other people, but from myself. Because when I'm always monitoring, always adjusting, always deciding how much of me is appropriate, I'm never fully inside the experience. I'm partially outside it. Watching, managing, containing. And that containment becomes a habit. One that's hard to notice because it's so consistent. Then there was control itself. The one I trusted the most. The one that made everything feel safe. If I can think it through, I can handle it. If I can predict it, I can avoid being affected by it. If I can stay composed, I won't lose myself in anything. And for a long time, that worked. Control gave me stability. It made my life manageable. It prevented chaos. But it also did something else. It limited what could enter my life. Because control doesn't just filter out risk. It filters out intensity. It filters out unpredictability. It filters out anything that doesn't fit into what I can understand before it happens. And that includes things I might actually want. Things I might feel drawn to. Things that don't make immediate sense but carry something deeper. I started to see that I wasn't just avoiding discomfort. I was avoiding depth. Not intentionally, but effectively. Because depth requires openness. And openness doesn't always feel safe. It doesn't always come with clarity. It doesn't always align with logic. And I had spent years prioritizing clarity over everything else. So naturally, anything that didn't come with clear reasoning got filtered out. Even if it mattered. Even if it was exactly what I needed. There's a certain kind of life you can build from that place. One that is stable, functional, predictable, but also contained. And containment has a limit. It can hold things together, but it can't create expansion. It can maintain, but it can't transform. And I think that's where I found myself. Not stuck, not broken, but contained in a way that didn't allow anything new to fully enter. Not because it wasn't available, but because I didn't have space for it. Because space requires something I hadn't practiced in a long time. Letting things in, without immediately evaluating them. Letting myself feel something, without adjusting it. Letting desire exist, without questioning whether it was valid. These weren't skills I had lost. They were ones I had stopped using. Because the quieter blocks in my life didn't demand attention. They didn't interrupt me. They just quietly shaped what I allowed, and what I didn't. And once I started to see them, I understood something that felt both simple and difficult. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with me. But there were layers I had built, that no longer served me. Layers that kept me safe, but also kept me distant. And removing them wasn't about breaking anything open. It was about noticing. Noticing where I had been holding back without realizing it. Noticing where I had been filtering myself before I could fully feel anything. Noticing where I had chosen control, even when it cost me connection. Because these blocks weren't obstacles in the usual sense. They were habits. Refined. Polished. Accepted. And that's what made them so easy to live with. And so difficult to see. Until I finally did. And once I saw them, I couldn't pretend they weren't there anymore. Not because they were wrong, but because I could feel what they were costing me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, every day. in ways I had been calling normal. What sexual energy really means. For a long time, I avoided the phrase entirely. Sexual energy sounded like something exaggerated, something that belonged in conversations I didn't trust. It felt disconnected from the way I experienced my life, too abstract, too intense, maybe even unnecessary. I thought it had nothing to do with me. But what I didn't realize was that I had been experiencing it all along. I had just been calling it something else. Or more accurately, I had stopped calling it anything at all. Because when I look back now, I can see there was always a current running through me. Not constant. Not always strong. But present. It showed up in the moments when something felt alive. Not exciting in the obvious sense. Not dramatic. Just charged. There are certain moments that don't look significant from the outside, but they leave a trace inside you. A conversation that lingers longer than it should. A glance that shifts something quietly. An idea that pulls your attention in a way you can't explain. A place, a sound, a memory that suddenly feels closer than everything else. That's where I started to recognize it. Not as something physical. Not as something performative. But as a kind of inner movement. A responsiveness. A subtle intensity that made everything feel more real. It wasn't about what was happening. It was about how I was experiencing it. There was a depth. A kind of emotional gravity that drew me in instead of pushing me through. And I began to understand something slowly, almost reluctantly. That is what people are trying to describe when they talk about sexual energy. Not the act. Not the surface. But the source. It's the part of me that feels desire not just for a person, but for anything. The part that leans toward something instead of evaluating it from a distance. The part that creates instead of just completing. It's the difference between doing something because I should, and being pulled toward something because I want to. And that difference changes everything. Because when that energy is present, I don't have to force myself into movement. Movement happens naturally. Attention becomes focused without effort. Time feels different, not faster or slower, but fuller. And most importantly, I feel connected. Not to something outside of me, but to myself. That's the part one had misunderstood. I thought connection came from external circumstances. From the right work. The right environment. The right people. But what I'm starting to see is that connection is internal first. And this energy, the one I couldn't name, is what creates that connection. Without it, everything becomes mechanical. Even things I care about. Even things that should matter. They lose depth. They lose weight. They become tasks. And when everything feels like a task, life becomes something I manage, not something I experience. That's where money began to make more sense to me. Not in a strategic way. In a reflective way. Because money, I've realized, doesn't just respond to effort. It responds to engagement. To where I am actually present. To where my attention has weight. To where something in me is invested, not logically, but emotionally. There's a difference between working on something and being inside it. And that difference isn't visible from the outside. But it's felt. Deeply. I remember thinking about that woman I saw in New York City again. Not because of what she was doing, but because of how she existed. There was no hesitation in her presence. No visible filtering. No sense that she was holding something back. And I couldn't explain it at the time, but now I see it more clearly. She wasn't trying to create anything. She was already connected to herself. And that connection created a kind of quiet magnetism. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that naturally held it. That's the quality I had been missing. Not confidence. Not discipline. Connection. And that connection is what gives energy direction. Because energy without direction dissipates. But energy with attention transforms. That's where the relationship between this internal current and money becomes clearer. Not as something mystical, but as something practical. When I am disconnected, everything I do feels like effort. I push through things. I complete them. I move on. There's no depth. No expansion. No real impact. But when I am connected, when that energy is present, something shifts. I don't approach things the same way. I don't force. I don't rush. I don't scatter my attention. I stay with something longer. I engage more fully. I respond instead of react. And that changes outcomes. Not instantly. Not dramatically. But consistently. Because depth creates movement in a way that effort alone cannot. This is the part I'm still learning to trust. Because it doesn't follow the rules I've relied on for so long. It doesn't always make sense at the beginning. It doesn't come with clear instructions. It asks me to feel something before I can explain it. To stay with something before I can justify it. To allow something to exist, without immediately turning it into a plan. And that's uncomfortable. Because I'm used to understanding things first. To having clarity before I move. But this energy works differently. It doesn't ask for permission. It asks for attention. And attention, I'm realizing, is something I've been giving away too easily. To distractions. To habits. To things that don't require anything from me. But when I bring that attention back, when I place it on something that actually matters to me, something that holds that subtle pull, this energy begins to gather. Not all at once. But gradually. And when it gathers, it changes the way I move through my life. Not by making me more productive, but by making me more present. And presence is what creates value. Not just externally, but internally. Because the more present I am, the more I can feel what actually matters. And the more I can feel that, the less I need to force anything. That's the quiet shift. The one I didn't see coming. The one that doesn't announce itself. That what I had dismissed as something abstract, something distant, something that didn't apply to me, was actually the most direct connection I had to myself. And maybe that's why it felt so unfamiliar. Because I had spent so long living without it, that feeling it again almost felt like discovering something new. When in reality, it had always been there, waiting. Not to be created, but to be noticed. Turning energy into direction. There was a moment I didn't expect. Not dramatic. Not transformative in the way people describe breakthroughs. It didn't come with clarity or certainty or a sudden sense that everything was about to change. It came as hesitation. A pause I didn't used to allow. I remember it clearly. I was sitting at my desk, staring at something I had done hundreds of times before. A task. A responsibility. Something I knew how to complete quickly, efficiently, without thinking too much about it. And for a second, something in me didn't move. Not resistance. Not laziness. Just stillness. Normally, I would have pushed through it. Started anyway. Finished it. Moved on. But that day, I didn't. I stayed in that pause longer than I was comfortable with. And in that space, something subtle became visible. There was a difference between moving because I should, and moving because something in me was actually engaged. I had spent years collapsing those two things into one. Action was action. Completion was completion. It didn't matter how I felt as long as things got done. But now, I could feel the difference. And once I felt it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Because that pause, that hesitation, wasn't a problem. It was information. Something in me wasn't aligned with what I was about to do. And instead of overriding it like I usually would, I stayed with it. That was the beginning. Not of doing something new, but of not doing something automatically. I started noticing how quickly I reacted to everything. A message comes in, I respond immediately. A task appears, I begin it without question. A feeling arises, I either suppress it or follow it without thinking. There was almost no space between stimulus and response. And that lack of space meant I was never actually choosing. I was just moving. So I began to experiment with something small. I didn't change what I was doing. I changed when I responded. When something appeared, a thought, a desire, an impulse, I didn't act on it right away. I let it stay. Even if it felt uncomfortable. Even if it didn't make sense. I gave it a few seconds. Sometimes longer. And something unexpected happened in that space. The energy didn't disappear. It changed. It became clearer. More defined. What felt like a vague impulse started to take shape. What felt like restlessness became something more specific. And for the first time, I could actually feel where it wanted to go. Not intellectually. Not strategically. But directly. Before, I thought direction came from planning. From thinking things through. From deciding what made the most sense. But now I was seeing something different. Direction comes from attention. Where I place my attention determines where my energy goes. And where my energy goes determines what grows. That sounds simple. But living it is not. Because attention is constantly being pulled. By habits. By distractions. By things that don't require anything from me. So if I don't choose where it goes everywhere. And when it goes everywhere, it builds nothing. That was the pattern I had been living in. Scattered attention. Fragmented energy. No depth. No accumulation. So I started with something almost invisible. I stopped filling every quiet moment. Mornings became the first place I noticed the shift. Instead of reaching for my phone immediately, I stayed still. Just for a few minutes. No input. No distraction. At first, it felt empty. Uncomfortable. Like something was missing. But slowly, that space started to feel different. Not empty. Open. There were thoughts. There were sensations. There were subtle movements inside me I hadn't noticed before. And instead of pushing past them, I stayed. Not to analyze. Not to fix. Just to notice. That alone began to gather something. A kind of internal coherence. Because my attention wasn't being pulled in multiple directions anymore. It was staying in one place. With me. I started doing the same thing throughout the day. Not all the time. Just in small moments. When I felt drawn to something, I noticed it. Instead of immediately turning it into a task, I stayed with the feeling. What is this? Why does this hold my attention? Not in a questioning way. In a curious way. And sometimes, nothing came from it. No action. No outcome. Just awareness. But other times, something shifted. The pull became stronger. Clearer. And when I did move, it felt different. Not forced. Not rushed. Not like something I had to complete. But like something I was already inside of. That's when I began to understand what it means to direct energy. It's not about controlling it. It's about allowing it to gather before moving it. Because when I react immediately, I release energy too quickly. It dissipates. It spreads out. It loses intensity. But when I let it build, even slightly, it becomes something else. It becomes focused. And focused energy has weight. It creates movement. Not through force, but through presence. There's also another part of this that surprised me. I stopped trying to make everything useful. For a long time, everything I engaged with had to lead somewhere. It had to be productive. It had to serve a purpose. But I started allowing myself to engage with things that didn't have a clear outcome. Reading something that interested me, even if it wasn't relevant. Writing something, even if no one would see it. Spending time with an idea, even if it didn't turn into anything. At first, it felt unnecessary, almost wasteful. But over time, I noticed something. Those moments weren't wasted. They were where my attention naturally wanted to go. And following that, without forcing it into a goal, allowed something deeper to form. A kind of internal direction that didn't come from obligation, but from alignment. That word used to feel abstract to me. Alignment. Now it feels very specific. It's the difference between pushing myself into something and moving with something that already has energy behind it. And that difference changes everything. Because when I move with something instead of against it, I don't have to use as much effort. I don't have to convince myself. I don't have to sustain motivation. The movement sustains itself. Not endlessly, but enough to create momentum. That's the part I'm still learning. Because it requires trust. Not in the outcome, but in the process of staying connected to what I feel, before I try to control it. It requires me to resist the urge to rush, to complete, to move on too quickly, and that's uncomfortable. Because I've spent years valuing speed, efficiency, completion. But now I'm beginning to see something else. That depth takes time. That energy needs space to gather. And that direction doesn't come from forcing movement, but from allowing something to become clear before I move at all. I'm not doing less, but I'm moving differently. And that difference is subtle, almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it changes everything. Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not just moving through my life. I can feel where I'm going. Even if I can't explain it yet. Receiving, desire, and expansion. There is a kind of discomfort that doesn't come from pain. It comes from receiving. I didn't recognize it at first because I didn't think of myself as someone who struggled with that. I was independent. Capable. I handled my own life. I didn't rely on people in ways that made me feel exposed or uncertain. That, to me, felt like strength. But what I didn't see, what I couldn't see from inside that identity, was how closed it had made me. Not closed in an obvious way. I wasn't distant. I wasn't cold. I could connect, respond, show up. I knew how to be present with others. But there was a limit. A subtle boundary I rarely crossed. I could give. I could manage. I could hold everything together. But receiving was different. Receiving required something I hadn't practiced in a long time. It required me to stop controlling. And control, for me, had become almost automatic. I noticed it in small moments. Someone would offer something, help, attention, kindness, and before I even had time to feel it, my response was already forming. I'm okay. I've got it. It's fine. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because allowing it to land felt unfamiliar, unnecessary, even. There was a quiet belief underneath it. That I should be able to handle things on my own. That needing or accepting something too easily meant I was dependent. And I didn't want to feel that way. So I stayed in motion. Doing. Handling. Managing. And from the outside, it looked like competence. But from the inside, it created a kind of subtle resistance. Not just to people. To life itself. Because receiving isn't only about what comes from others. It's about what I allow to reach me. A moment. An opportunity. A shift. Something good that doesn't require effort. And I began to notice how often I deflected those things. Not consciously, but consistently. Something would go well, and I would downplay it. Something would feel easy, and I would question it. Something would open, and I would hesitate. As if ease itself needed to be justified. As if anything that came without effort wasn't entirely real. And that pattern ran deeper than I realized. Because it wasn't just about receiving. It was about desire. I had spent so much time focusing on what needed to be done, that I stopped asking myself what I actually wanted. Not in a surface-level way. Not in terms of goals or plans. But in a quiet, honest way. What do I feel drawn to? What do I want more of? What feels like expansion instead of obligation? Those questions didn't come easily. Not because I didn't have answers, but because I had stopped listening for them. Desire, for me, had become something to manage, to filter, to minimize. Because desire can be inconvenient. It can complicate things. It can lead somewhere unexpected. And I had built a life around predictability. So naturally, anything that disrupted that was softened, adjusted, quieted. But as I started to reconnect with that internal energy, the one that moves without needing permission, I began to see desire differently. Not as something to control, but as something to follow, carefully. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but honestly. Because desire isn't just about wanting more. It's about direction. It points toward something. Even if I don't fully understand it. Even if it doesn't make sense right away. And when I ignore it completely, I lose that direction. I stay in what I already know. What already works. What already feels safe. But nothing expands there. Expansion requires something different. It requires allowing space for something new to enter. And that's where receiving comes back in. Because I can't expand if I'm constantly holding everything tightly. If I'm always controlling, always managing, always deciding in advance what should happen, there's no room for anything unexpected. And sometimes, what I need doesn't arrive through effort. It arrives through openness. That idea challenged me more than I expected. Because openness isn't passive. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means not closing things off before they have a chance to reach me. It means staying present long enough to feel what's actually happening, instead of immediately interpreting it. I started practicing that in small ways. Not as a rule. Not as something to perfect. Just as something to notice. When something felt good, I didn't rush past it. I stayed with it. When something came easily, I didn't question it immediately. I allowed it. When something sparked even a small sense of desire, I didn't dismiss it. I paid attention. And slowly, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough to feel the difference. I began to notice that my capacity to receive wasn't fixed. It could expand. Not through effort, but through allowance. Through not interrupting what was already trying to reach me. And with that, my sense of desire changed too. It became clearer, less filtered, less constrained by what I thought I should want, more connected to what I actually felt. And that connection created movement. Not forced, not urgent, but real. Because when I allow myself to want something, without immediately controlling it, I create a kind of internal opening. And that opening changes how I move through everything. Even money. Because money, I'm starting to see, doesn't only come from what I do. It also comes from what I allow. What I accept. What I am available for. If I am closed, if I am constantly rejecting ease, questioning opportunity, minimizing what comes, then it doesn't matter how much I do. There's a limit to what can enter. But when I open, even slightly, something changes. Not in a way that's always visible, but in a way that is felt. There is more flow, more responsiveness, more space for things to move. And I think that's the part I'm still learning. That expansion isn't about pushing outward. It's about allowing inward. Allowing more experience, more sensation, more possibility, without needing to control all of it. That doesn't mean everything becomes easy. It doesn't mean everything works out. But it does mean something important. I am no longer closed to what is trying to reach me. And that alone creates a different kind of life. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more open. And in that openness, things begin to change. Quietly. Without force. In ways I couldn't have planned, even if I tried. The quiet shift no one sees. Nothing in my life looks dramatically different. That's the part that's hardest to explain. If someone were to look at me now, the same routines, the same work, the same city, the same quiet rhythm of days, they wouldn't notice a shift. There's no visible transformation. No clear before and after. I still wake up in the same space. I still sit at the same desk. I still move through the same streets in New York City, surrounded by the same noise, the same urgency, the same constant motion that never seems to pause. From the outside, everything continues exactly as it was. But something inside me no longer feels the same. And the difference is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It's subtle. But once I felt it, I couldn't go back to not knowing it was there. I notice it in the way I wake up now. There's a brief moment before anything begins, before thoughts organize themselves, before the day starts asking for something from me. That moment used to pass unnoticed. Now, I feel it. Not as something I need to hold on to. Just as something that exists. A quiet sense of being present before I become who I need to be for the day. And sometimes, that's all that changes. Just a few seconds of awareness. But those seconds matter. Because they remind me that I'm not just moving through my life automatically anymore. I'm inside it. Even if only briefly, I notice it in the way I move through conversations. I'm not as quick to respond. Not because I'm trying to be careful, but because I don't feel the same urgency to fill every space. There's more room, more silence. And in that silence, something else appears. Not always clarity, but honesty. What I say feels closer to what I actually mean. What I don't say feels just as intentional. There's less adjustment. Less subtle reshaping of myself to fit what's expected. And that changes the experience. Not dramatically, but enough. I notice it in the way I approach my work. The tasks themselves haven't changed, but my relationship to them has. There are moments now where I feel fully inside what I'm doing. Not because it's exciting, not because it's new, but because I'm actually present for it. And that presence gives even ordinary things a different texture. Less mechanical, less distant, more real. Other times, I feel the absence of that connection. And instead of pushing through it immediately, I recognize it. I see when I'm moving without being there. When I'm completing something but not experiencing it. And that awareness alone changes how long I stay in that state. Because before, I wouldn't have noticed. Now, I do. And noticing creates choice. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But gradually. I notice it most clearly in how money feels. Not in the amount. Not in the numbers. But in the way I relate to it. It no longer feels entirely separate from me. It feels responsive. Not predictable. Not controlled. But connected to something deeper than effort alone. There are moments when opportunities appear in ways I can't fully explain. Not because I chased them. Not because I planned them perfectly, but because something in me was open enough to see them and respond. And other times, things feel still, unmoving. And instead of forcing something to happen, I can sit with that stillness longer than I used to. Not comfortably, but consciously. There's less panic in the absence of movement. Less urgency to fix what hasn't even fully revealed itself yet. That, more than anything, feels new. Not needing everything to move all the time. Not needing constant confirmation that things are working. Trusting something quieter. Something slower. Even if I don't fully understand it. Relationships have shifted too. Not because I changed anyone. Not because I set new rules or boundaries in a dramatic way. But because I stopped leaving myself in them. That's the only way I can describe it. Before, I would be present physically, but partially absent internally. Adjusting. Monitoring. Managing how I showed up. Now, there are moments where I don't do that. Where I stay with what I actually feel. And that changes the dynamic without needing to explain anything. Some connections feel deeper. Others feel less necessary. And I don't rush to define or fix that. I just notice. That word keeps returning. Notice. Because that's where everything begins now. Not with action. Not with change. But with awareness. And awareness is quiet. It doesn't force anything. It doesn't demand immediate movement. It simply reveals. And once something is revealed, it's hard to ignore. I still fall back into old patterns. More often than I'd like. There are days when I move through everything automatically. When I disconnect without realizing it. When I go back to controlling, managing, filtering everything. And the difference now is not that I've eliminated those patterns. It's that I can see them. While they're happening. Sometimes only after. But still. I see them. And that seeing creates a small opening. A chance to return. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just slightly. Back into myself. That's the shift. Not a transformation. Not a reinvention. Just a gradual return. To something that was always there. Something I didn't lose. Just something I stopped noticing. I think that's the part one misunderstood for so long. I thought I needed to become someone else. To fix something. To build something new. But now, it feels different. It feels like remembering. Like recognizing something familiar that I had overlooked. And the more I allow that recognition to happen, the less I feel the need to force anything. Because what I was searching for wasn't outside my life. It wasn't hidden in some future version of myself. It was in the way I was experiencing what already existed. And changing that doesn't require a dramatic shift. It requires attention, presence, willingness to stay with what I feel, even when it's unclear, even when it doesn't lead anywhere immediately. Because something is happening in those moments. Even if I can't see it yet. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it was always enough. To stop trying to become something else. And instead, slowly return to what I already am. There's no moment where everything clicks. No final resolution. No clear ending. Just this quiet awareness that something has changed. And it continues to change. Not outwardly. Not visibly. But internally. In a way that no one else can see. But I can feel. And that's enough to know. I'm no longer just moving through my life. I'm inside it again. Even if only for moments at a time. Even if I still lose it. Even if I'm still learning how to stay. Because those moments are real. And once I've felt them, I know they're mine. Not something I have to create. Not something I have to chase. Just something I have to stop walking away from. When I look back at everything I've lived through, nothing dramatic, Nothing visibly broken. I can finally see the truth that was hidden in plain sight. I didn't lose my life. I didn't make the wrong choices. I didn't miss my chance. I simply drifted away from myself. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone could notice. But slowly, through small decisions that felt right at the time. I chose stability over sensation. Control over curiosity. Clarity over connection. And in doing that, I built a life that works, but doesn't always feel like it belongs to me. I became someone reliable, someone composed, someone who could carry everything without falling apart. But in the process, I stopped feeling the quiet signals inside me. The subtle pull toward something. The moments of aliveness that don't come from achievement, but from presence. The kind of energy that doesn't need to be explained, only felt. And that's what this entire journey has revealed to me. It was never about money. It was never about success. It was never about doing more. It was about connection. Because when I am disconnected from myself, everything becomes effort. I push, I plan, I perform. And even when things work, they feel flat. Temporary. Unanchored. But when I am connected even slightly, something shifts. I don't chase as much. I don't force as much. I notice more. I feel more. And strangely, things begin to respond. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But differently. Because life doesn't just respond to what I do. It responds to how present I am while doing it. It responds to whether I am actually there, or just going through the motions. The deepest lesson I've learned is this. The energy I was searching for was never missing. It was just waiting for my attention. Waiting for me to stop overriding it. Waiting for me to stop managing every feeling before it could fully exist. Waiting for me to trust something I couldn't immediately explain. And maybe that's what this middle really is. Not a failure. Not a dead end. But a quiet space between who I've been and who I'm slowly returning to. A place where nothing looks different yet, but everything feels slightly more real. So if you're here, listening to this, and something inside you feels familiar. Not broken. Not desperate. Just quietly disconnected. Then maybe the lesson isn't to fix your life. Maybe it's to start noticing where you've stopped feeling it. And gently, without force, begin to return. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Just enough to feel something real again. Because that's where everything begins. And that's where everything changes. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Now I want to ask you something simple. Be honest with yourself. Right now, which one feels closer to your reality? A. I feel like I'm doing everything right, but something still feels empty. B. I feel lost and overwhelmed, like I don't even know where to begin. Comment A or B below. There's no right answer, just your truth. And if you feel comfortable, share a little more. What part of your life feels the most disconnected right now? Your work? Your relationships? Or just yourself? I read every comment. And sometimes, just seeing that someone else feels the same way, changes more than we expect. If this spoke to you in any way, subscribe to the channel. Not for motivation. Not for answers. But for something quieter, deeper, and more honest. So we can keep exploring this space together.